please, oh please, never start a story with the weather. Might be the most heard writing rule of all time, from your primary school English class to your college writing course. In fact, it's such a well-known narrative crime that the great crime writer Elmore Leonard, in his 10 Rules of Writing, listed as number 1. Never open with the weather. 2. Avoid prologues. 3. Never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. You get the point. But you might be wondering, hang on a second, what's so bad about the weather? Well, let me put it like this. Would you want to open a book in an attempt to relax and escape the weather outside, only to read about more weather inside? Boring. Unless you're Charles Dickens and mastered the art of writing, because for some reason his novel Bleak House, his best novel by the way, which I've just finished reading, it gets away with the worst crime known to the reading subspecies of mankind: weather and a prologue, and using a verb other than said to carry dialogue. In fact, the first chapter of Bleak House alone breaks all 10 of Elmore Leonard's rules of writing. So who's right, Charles Dickens or Elmore Leonard? Well, you might be saying, James, Charles Dickens writes literature, Elmore Leonard writes crime fiction. They're different, and you would be right. But at the deepest level, I think all art is the same. Because it appears to me that no matter the genre, no matter the art form, the proverb, it's not what you do, it's how you do it, is a fundamental truth of all art. Or put even simpler, it's not the what, it's the how. A film that takes place in one room sounds boring, unless it's 12 Angry Men. A play in which, quote, nothing happens twice, yet boring, unless it's Waiting for Godot. A YouTube channel that reviews only fast food. Across the board, boring, I'm sorry, unless it's Report of the Week. But books that start with the weather? Yeah, definitely boring, unless it's, well, out of curiosity, I went through my entire little library just to see how many books of whatever genre start with the weather. Now the result, out of 1,040 books, was that only 36 of them, or 3.5%, started with weather. Here's the names if you're interested. But more to the point, how many did it successfully, with panache? Surprisingly, 31 of the 36, or 86%, succeeded in making the weather opening, if not necessary, a thing of beauty. For example, to quote a few, Good Omens has the ironic, "It was a nice day. All the days had been nice. There had been rather more than 7 of them so far, and rain hadn't been invented yet." Darkly Dreaming Dexter has a slightly predatory, also slightly ironic, "Moon. Glorious moon, full, fat, reddish moon. The night as light as day. The moonlight flooding down across the land and bringing joy, joy, joy." Of course, that joy is the joy of murder, but who doesn't love Dexter? Speaking of murder, Richard III has the classic, "Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York." Lastly, my favorite, Murphy by Samuel Beckett. "The sun shone, having no alternative on the nothing near." And as an honorable mention, we must acknowledge what so many have called the worst opening of all time, from Paul Clifford by Edward Bulwer Lytton. "It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals when it was checked by a violent gust of wind which swept up the streets, for it is in London that our scene lies, rattling along the housetops and fiercely agitating the scanty flame of the lamps that struggled against the darkness." Now, I don't care what people say, I love this opening. It has the gusto and drama that so much of today's writing lacks. But San Jose State University thought differently, and in honor of the opening, they created the Bulwer Lytton Fiction Contest, in which entrants had to, quote, compose the opening sentence to the worst of all possible novels, and you can go and read each year's winner over on their site. But guess what else is named after Mr. Edward Bulwer Lytton? The youngest son of Charles Dickens. That's right, Edward Bulwer Lytton, author of the so-called worst opening of all time, was besties with Charles Dickens, author of what I call the best opening of all time. But to come now full circle, it is Dickens's opening that best proves the truth of the aforementioned idea. It's not the what, it's the how. So let's explore just how Charles Dickens gets away with starting his novel Bleak House with not just one sentence about the weather, not just one paragraph about the weather, no, but but a whole page describing London's famously atrocious weather. Honestly, I think this is the opening of openings. If you think you know a better one, please tell me in the comments. Now, without further ado, Chapter 1 in Chancery. London. Michaelmas term lately over and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes, gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs, undistinguishable in mire, horses scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers, foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper and losing their foothold at street corners where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. There are 5 things that Dickens does in the opening that hotwire our brains and trick us into happily reading about the weather. The first thing he does is the most straightforward yet hardest to imitate. Dickens describes the weather with charm. He wants to delight the reader, as when he imagines the jolly possibility of meeting a megalosaurus in the street, or the comical, rather poignant image of dogs undistinguishable in the mire. He's not just dryly recounting the facts as so much of today's literature does, which at the sentence level at least seems not to care much about delighting or charming the reader. But back to the point, Dickens also uses a little stylistic feature that adds something electric to the charm. That is, every sentence is missing a primary verb and has only subject and object, some with joined on secondary clauses. And this omission of verbs creates a certain journalistic vibe, as if you were reading a fantastical weather report in the newspaper. This lack of primary motion from the lack of primary verbs gives us the sense of standing stock still in the street and observing the chaos about us. Indeed, we are inside a portrait, London's portrait, as the ingenious one-word declarative first sentence states, London. If we look a little closer though, we find that the second thing Dickens does is to use the weather to magnify the meaning of his story, which becomes more evident with each paragraph. But let me explain. This is not just a portrait of mud, but a tonal portrait of the moral state of London and his how. Dickens playfully paints a tone of dirtiness and darkness with 4 images. 1. He implies that the biblical flood has just ended and that mankind is still close to and recovering from its antediluvian depravity. 2. The death of the sun, common symbol for the light of truth or reason. 3. The ill temper of the slipping and sliding crowds of muddy people. And 4. The crusts of mud accumulating on the pavement at compound interest as if the mud itself were money. Such an undercurrent of meaning gives the images a spiritual or tonal force, making them feel inevitable, which is precisely what separates good prose from purple prose. The final effect that this sustained lack of verbs has is that it propels the reader forward, at least subconsciously, to that future first verb which will unlock and activate this opening portrait into primary motion. But before that, this verblessness must persist for 2 more paragraphs. Number 2. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river where it flows among green aites and meadows. Fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and ball of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of a shivering little prentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all around them as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Following the previous portrait of mud, we now have a portrait of fog, which is described as if it were a poisonous vapor infecting everything it touched, and which seems to touch everything. The fog is so unrelenting that 5 of the 6 sentences start with the word fog, as well as 11 of the 12 main clauses. London is blind with fog. As happened with the mud before, it soon becomes clear from the suggestive images that the fog may stand for something else, a creeping spiritual blindness enveloping nature, commerce, and man. And as G.K. Chesterton observed of the novel, the fog of the first chapter never lifts. Indeed, if you remove this single paragraph from the book, you would not only ruin the effect of the whole opening, but a small part of the effect of the entire book. This then brings us to our third point. Dickens makes describing the weather necessary to his telling of the story. And through all this necessary fogginess, we as readers feel that there is a payoff, a punchline coming to make sense of all this accumulating weather. So onwards we are propelled. The third paragraph, short and sweet, goes, gas looming through the fog in diverse places in the streets, much of the sun may from the spongy field be seen to loom by husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look. And so we complete our triple portrait of mud, fog, and gas. And because I don't really know what gas is supposed to look like inside of fog, the most I can say is that Dickens's metaphor may be that gas is a man's own contribution of flammable fog, or spiritual blindness, in his attempt to see through the omnipresent fog of London. But that hardly matters, because the 4th and 5th paragraphs bring everything to a precise climax, and with our first long-awaited verb. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar, in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. Never can there come fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep to assort with the groping and floundering condition which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. Isn't that a marvelous way to collapse our triple portrait of mud, fog, and gas onto the head of one person and one place of employment? And that leads us to our 4th point. Dickens leads the description of weather seamlessly into his telling of the story, and he makes it seamless with rhetoric and charm. For instance, the first of these 2 paragraphs is a perfect masterclass in the use of repetition in both word and sentence to achieve a heaping up effect. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, so as to release that heap onto an object or someone's head. That great release pours down in the last sentence of the first paragraph, the highly ironic. At the heart of the fog sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. This is the payoff of the whole opening, and is the 5th and final thing that Dickens does that makes his strange weather opening a sublime memory. Note too that in that last sentence, the double high and double chance sounds give it that wonderful ironic ring, since someone who is the most high should have the clearest view like a god in heaven. But this High Chancellor sits at the blindest spot possible, the very heart of the fog. This payoff retroactively confers an additional meaning on the first 3 paragraphs of weather, that they were leading back to the metaphorical source of it all, the demigod of bad London weather, the Lord High Chancellor. So, thinking about the idea is not the what, it's the how. How then do you start a story with the weather? Easy. According to Charles Dickens, 1. Describe the weather with charm. Stylistic innovation helps. 2. Imbue the weather with meaning related to the story. 3. Make describing the weather necessary to the telling of the story. 4. Lead the description of weather into the description of story. And 5. Culminate your weather talk in a payoff that kicks off the story. And just by looking at these 5 rules, I think we can distill the last 4 into one rule. All description must be in service to the story. If not, it's purple prose. Or in other words, despite what everyone has told you, in art, you can get away with anything as long as you're 1, charming, and 2, serving the story. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.